Hello and welcome to the Celtic Way Sitdown, where today we'll be talking about the life and legacy of the greatest Celtic manager, bar none, Jock Stein. And joining myself, Tony Haggerty, and Sean Martin on the Celtic Way Sitdown is a very special guest. Now, you want to talk about talent, Sean? We'll get a load of this. Jonny Owen has been an actor, a producer, a voiceover artist, a comedian, a musician, a songwriter. He grew up supporting Cardiff and Merthyr Tydfil, and he's a director of Nottingham Forest, but he's also married his passion for film producing and filmmaking with football, and he's produced three wonderful films. The first one being I Believe in Miracles, the story of Nottingham Forest's 1979 and 1980 European Cup triumphs, and also Don't Take Me Home, the story of Wales' qualification for their first ever European finals in 58, major tournament qualification in 58 years at Euro 2016. And he also did the wonderful film that we'll come on to talk about, The Three Kings, where Sir Matt Busby, Bill Shankly and Jock Stein built the clubs Manchester United, Liverpool and Celtic respectively. So on that note, what a guest to have. We salute you and we clap and we say, welcome to the Celtic Way Sitdown. Jonny Owen, how are you, sir?
I'm very good, lads. I'm delighted and honoured that you've asked me on. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you very much. It's a lovely introduction. I should get you to be my PR man, Tony.
Yeah. That's not the first person that said that, Tony, is it?
And for those that don't know, Jonny also does a radio show on TalkSport called Jonny Owen and Friends. I'd like to think I'm one of his friends, but maybe not. But there you go. Now, Jonny, we've spoken before, but the reason that the link with yourself and Jock Stein is, Jock Stein was a minor. Your father, Brian, was also a minor, and he brought Jock Stein to your attention at a very young age, didn't he?
He did, Tony, yeah. My father worked underground. He's an electrician. Not unusual in South Wales when I was growing up. A lot of my classmates were the same, you know. And whenever an ex-miner popped up on television, he'd always point it out. So whenever Jock Stein come on television, Bill Shankly, Matt Busby, they worked underground as well. They started underground. Jock Stein, of the three, worked the longest underground, famously, well into his mid-20s, really. So it really stayed with me. My father passed in 2017, and I thought there's a generation of men and women that are leaving us now. And I thought it would be a good time to sort of tell the story. The great Scottish journalist Hugh McIlvenney did a wonderful series back 30 years ago now called The Football Men, which I really enjoyed as a young boy. And I just thought to myself, there's an opportunity to bring Leia's story to a new audience. And it went down fantastically well. It's done great figures on Amazon Prime. And I haven't had to buy a pint in Glasgow ever since.
You spoke about Hugh McIlvanney there, who also wrote Jock Stein's obituary. And it's one of the best pieces of writing I think I've ever read, Jonny, in my life. It struck a chord with me, and anyone who's ever read that or get the chance to go and seek it out, you'll just marvel at the words that he wrote down.
I read it again last night, actually, Tony, and you, because I was talking to you about it yesterday, you quoted it. You quoted the intro in a piece about Jock Stein last year, and I was rereading that as well. The larcenous nature of death was
it was, yeah. And I mean, the greatest manager, Celtic manager that ever lived, Jonny. We've spoken before off air, and you think what Stein's teams did, you say it's up there with one of the greatest achievements in football history, don't you?
I go out there now and say I think it's the greatest achievement in domestic football history ever. The big question people would always ask me at when they were interviewing about the film was, which manager would you choose? And I used to say, well, if I won the Euros, Euro Millions, and I had £500 million to spend in a time machine, I would pick Jock Stein in 1967. I think he was an extraordinary manager. And I'm not alone saying that. Sir Alex Ferguson says the same, doesn't he? He said that great quote. He won the European Cup with a Glasgow District 11. It's a great line. But what he, I think the young Stein had a bit of everything. John Robertson, who I made a film about with the great Nottingham Forest team of 1979, said something really interesting to me. He said the great Nottingham Forest team of the late 70s had a bit of everything. And I think that Celtic team had that as well. And Jock Stein had that as a manager. He was a wonderful man motivator. He walked in a room. Archie McPherson, who was a good mutual friend of us both, wrote a wonderful autobiography about him. One of the best football autobiographies I've ever read. And he used to say, like, when Jock walked in a room, people would stand up You know, he had that kind of presence. So he was amazing. So he was charismatic man, but tactically, you know, streets ahead of most managers, and played football in a way that, you know, they talk about total football that came later with the great Ajax team and Cruyff and all that. But he was doing the same. He was doing the same. And people forget things like, you know, the Celtic were really successful right into the early 70s in Europe. And then, of course, you know, he went to Leeds for a few days. He was homesick, Jock. He was a real man of Lanarkshire, as Archie famously says. But, you know, he got Scotland to tournaments, you know, and now you see how difficult it is to get a country, small country, to make sure. Jock did it. You know, the word is overused in the morning. He was a football genius. Jock Stein was absolutely a football genius.
I mean, you mentioned Scotland there, but we're coming to this from a Celtic perspective primarily, but he made an impact at Dunfermline as well. I mean,
absolutely.
Relegation battles when they got there, won a Scottish Cup. I think he even got them at the Cup Winners' Cup quarterfinals and stuff. Hibs won I think it was like the Summer Cup, which wasn't a massive trophy, but it was still their first trophy in over a decade. There were relegation battles. In fact, I think if I'm right, I think he's still get the highest win percentage of any Hibs manager ever that's managed 50 games or more. I think which is just
extraordinary. Me and Tony often talk about it. Instant impact with Stein. You know, I mean, Shankly and Busby had that in them as well, but Shankly had gone around a few of the outposts of English football, you know, Workington, and he ended up famously at Huddersfield and was struggling there because they were making him sell his best players. Whereas Stein went to places and within weeks turned teams around. It was extraordinary. Hibs is a great example. You know, it got to the point where, again, I'll quote Archie McPherson, Celtic couldn't ignore him anymore. They were going, well, he's done everything and now he's doing it there. We've got to get him in. And again, at Celtic, instant impact. Within, you know, weeks of arriving, he would turn it around. I think, like you said, that mid-60s period, Jock Stein, I mean, what an extraordinary man. You know, everywhere he went, instant impact. I think, you know, he's up there with saying he's one of the greatest domestic managers that ever lived.
Johnny, there's that brilliant quote as well. When he did come back, and he said when he was asked to come back, he wasn't going to come back unless you get full control.
That's right.
There's that clip, you know, and he said, but I didn't think it would work because Celtic traditionally had committees and all that and directors. Yeah. But he railroaded against that. He got his wish, and the football department was left solely to him. It was a wise move by Celtic to do that.
It's slightly understating it.
They had a committee to pick players. Also, because obviously of his religion, they kept trying to persuade him sort of to joint manage them with Sean Fallon. And bless him, Jock went, no, I only come back unless I get full control. Very similar to what happened with Busby and Shankly, interestingly, at Liverpool and Manchester United. And they left him to it. And again, you know, showing how astute Jock was, he didn't change too many things. You know, Celtic had gone through a real lean period. People forget this, you know, but he didn't mess around. He went in and he'd seen what he had. Now, of course, he'd been there as the sort of reserve team manager previously, so he knew what he was going into. But there wasn't an exodus of players, you know, that people expected and all that. He basically just sort of tinkered with a few things. And he you know, again, Stein famously said, once he won that Scottish Cup, the first trophy, he said it broke a lot of barriers for a lot of players that they thought they could win this. Clough said a very similar thing where Forest won the Anglo-Scottish Cup, which was a real long forgotten tournament. But he said when I watched them win it, they got the taste for winning more, you know. And Celtic definitely had that. The thing with Stein was he was relentless in his want of trophies. He wasn't one to rest on his laurels. He became a trophy winning machine. And I always remember we showed the film in Glasgow to an audience, and it was packed out there. And at the end, I just flash up the trophies they'd won. And obviously, Shankly comes up and Busby. It's very impressive. And then Stein comes up, and there was an audible gasp in the crowd because it filled the screen. It literally filled the screen with the trophies he'd won, and everywhere. You know, you just realise he was a trophy-winning machine as well. Stein. That was the thing about him.
You kind of mentioned it there when he was at Celtic before as a reserve coach and stuff. So he was essentially the youth coach to a clutch of that 1967 team that went on to win everything, which I think must be unique. That aspect of it as well, being a lot of these players' youth coach as well as the coach that led them to ultimate glory, that kind of thing. Yeah,
well, he loved Celtic Football Club. You know, again, to quote Archie, he loved the fans in particular. He did have a special connection with them. I think that came from when he went to play with them. Obviously, because he was a Protestant and his father was, you know, very much a Rangers fan. He supported Rangers as a boy. John Robertson has a similar thing, actually. Grew up as a Rangers fan. But once the Celtic club embraced him, and he lost a lot of friends, mutual friends, who sort of, he became, and I think it's almost a religious quote, there's nothing so zealous as a convert. When somebody's converted to a side, they become more zealous than the people with all that. And I think Stein had that. It became almost in his DNA to want to beat Rangers and dominate them. He used to say that it was always his big game. Didn't matter if it was a European Cup final or whatever, his big game was against Rangers, and that was really important to him. And I think, his connection with the Celtic support was very much part of him never being, Manchester United came in for Jock Stein, offered him to go there as manager with full control. He couldn't go, couldn't leave. And it was always, at the very end that, maybe his time was up, because he hadn't won a title for 1 year. I think he won it in the final year. But, he'd kind of set a precedent for himself. Johnny Giles gave me a wonderful line in the film when he went, football's the only business in the world where the more successful you are, the more pressure you're under the following season. We see it now with Jurgen Klopp, for argument's sake. Just he lost the game as Liverpool fans, so it doesn't matter what you do, the pressure builds up, and Stein almost became, at the end, a victim of his own success, really, because Celtic fans were like, well, unless we win the treble, it's not been a good season for us, and that's what happened to him at the end.
I mean, their greatest triumph, Johnny, in Lisbon, it's a 2-1 annihilation.
Yeah.
I appeared on Talk Sport a while ago, and I said to you, we were talking about that, and we called it the rip-roaring, free-scoring, never boring Celtic. But you look at the stats from that game, it's never a 2-1 game in its life. If you were to do the statistic analysis just now.
To watch the whole game, obviously, for the film, I went through it all. And it's not hyperbole for me to say Celtic battered them second half. It was just relentless, and they kept going until they scored. And a lot of teams would have thought, it's maybe not our day, because, there were so many chances they had. But you only felt it was only going to be. I mean, Inter Milan looked overawed, really. It was the energy, the way they played. We talk about in a modern game, the pressing game and the way Klopp plays and all that. Celtic were doing it then. Every time Inter Milan got the ball, it looked like it was a personal affront to the Celtic team to get it. They got the ball off and they were on them and they got it back and camped in their half in the second half. No two ways about it. It's extraordinary. It was the most one-sided 2-1 I think I've ever seen. And there's that great bit of commentary at half time where Archie again, wonderful, but he goes, Celtic really are trying to end the ice age of defensive European football here. It was seen. My father used to talk about it brilliantly. He used to say, it was a game that everybody who loved the game of football wanted Celtic to win. He said it just did because, Inter Milan played in a very specific way. They invented the Catenaccio, wasn't it? And it means even more Italian. It's not even a boat, it's a rusty boat. It's just rusted onto you. That's the way it translates. And Celtic broke that bolt open. They poured it full of oil and they split it apart. And it was a real triumph for football right across the game. There was some amazing pieces written at the time about it. And I think with time, the achievement only gets grander for me because of Inter Milan's status in the game, the money they had, the way they played and all the rest of it. It was an extraordinary triumph, really, what Celtic did.
Was there any stories, because obviously in a documentary you don't necessarily get to include everything that you want, was there any Jock Stein stories or elements that you never got to include in that?
There was one that I wish I didn't have time, but whenever they played Rangers, Celtic, he was playing for Celtic then, his father couldn't bring himself to say good luck, wouldn't talk to him on the morning of a match. And there's a great story that he's leaving his house with his boots in a bag. And his mother comes out and says, good luck, son. I hope you win. And it's a lovely little story that his mother went, I don't listen to him in there. You go and do your best, And I thought it was about, in time I was a bit, I wish I'd put that in actually, because it just shows how, sectarianism at that time especially was so riven in Scotland that his own father couldn't say to him on the morning of the match, good luck. It's extraordinary. But his mother came out and said it to him. I'm glad she did, because Jock deserved that.
On that note, there was I was reading recently, even might have been a couple of days ago, it was the Hibs club doctor at the time when Jock Stein was there. He obviously wasn't there that long before Celtic came calling. Yeah. And I think the impression that the club doctor got was he was feeling a wee bit guilty leaving so soon when Celtic approached. But the club doctor said that Jock's wife, Jean, had kind of expressed, not sure you should go back, that kind of thing. And it was primarily, reportedly anyway, primarily to do with what you mentioned there, the losing friends, the last time he'd been there as a player, as a reserve team manager, people had essentially dropped him because of the religious aspect and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think she was a wee bit wary of going back into that atmosphere and stuff. Obviously, he chose to go back anyway. The club doctor says, "Jock, you're a Celtic man. You can't turn it down." He never turned it down. But was that something you felt yourself? The kind of that kind of story?
Me and Tony have talked about it at length. I mean, when he finally left, there were certain people in Celtic at board level that were waiting for him just not to win a title. And he always felt that was, they were ready to sort of say, well, he's not one of us really. So he felt it, Jock, But again, coming back to it, he did have an extraordinary connection with the Celtic support. And that was the difference, really. He wanted to do it for them. There's a great bit in the film where he goes, "I just like the supporters," that's what he says, and all the other politics around it, sort of, did bring him down in the end. And I think with Jock, I mean, I love watching his interviews because he's such again, that's why he made the film. He belongs to a different generation, He's kind of like, there's a great story Archie says where somebody rings up to complain about seeing Jimmy Johnson in a pub late that night, and he does this great thing where the guy rings up and he goes, "Oh, I'm a Celtic season ticket holder." "All right," Jock says, "Yeah, go on." "Seat number." "All right." Yeah. And that we got, I don't, he didn't care. "All right, you're grassing somebody, and you're all right. Just crack on." He was of that sort of school of like, no nonsense, as they say, And Ferguson as well tells wonderful stories about, where about Stein, and they drink lots of cups of tea because Jock never drank. But he just, and he never slept. He never drank. He never slept. Famously, that's what they all say about him. And but he'd drink tea late into the night. And Ferguson would be, "Are we going to go to bed because we've got a match tomorrow?" And Jock, "Well, no, we'll brew another pot of coffee." And he'd just talk football and stories and football. He was a football man, to his bones. Jock. That was the thing about him. And everybody that was in his presence, and I'm the same listening to thing, you knew you were in the presence of somebody that was, hugely charismatic, a one-off. And I would have just listened to him all night, just talking about football and his stories. I mean, what a privilege that would have been to be with Jock Stein for an evening.
Now, Johnny, you were there, sadly.
I was, yeah.
In 1985. When I don't know how old you would have been. You'd have been pretty young.
I was 14. I was 14, yeah.
14. And you were there the night when Scotland qualified for the playoff against Australia and knocked Wales out, but
knocked us out again.
But it all kind of paled into insignificance when the news filtered through. And I just wanted you to give us a flavour of that, how you were there in it's a kind of monumental moment in sporting history when Jock Stein passed, and kind of how the circumstances of it all came about.
Yeah, I remember it vividly, lads. Actually, it was a huge game. It was a sellout. It was at Ninian Park, which is Cardiff's old ground. I was in the grandstand paddocks. It was 2 paddocks. Scotland brought thousands down, magnificent support. And what I remember Wales scoring quite early. I think Mark Hughes scored. I can remember being, excited, and my father and my grandfather with me. And I can just remember as I went into the second half, them going, "We need another goal." I can just remember them both saying, "We need another goal," and me thinking, "No, we'll be all right." But they were right. They were going, "We need another goal to put this to bed," because Wales had a really good team. They had Rush and Hughes up front, and we'd won in Scotland. But it wasn't to be. Davy Cooper famously scored the penalty, which was Jock Stein's last ever sort of tactical move. He brought Davy Cooper on and got Scotland over the line, which was amazing. But I remember lots of yellow flags. I think my mind's eye now, which was the Lions rampant, obviously.
Yeah.
And after the game, obviously Scotland fans were delirious, celebrating. But I remember as word was spreading very quickly, even then, because people had transistor radios. And I can remember my father, certainly my grandfather, over my head going, as men did, having conversations, as steam apparently, and the word being passed around the Welsh crowd. And obviously my own man had worked underground from a mining area, and he was really loved in South Wales. He played for Llanelli famously. And as the word spread to the crowd, I can remember looking across at the Scottish fans coming out, and the flag stopped being waved as word was spreading. That's what I remember. That like a hush descending on the crowds. And we walked out, and it was silence outside. And we got in the car, sat in a queue, and we put the radio on. And I can remember the radio saying that Jock Stein has passed away this evening, and just silence in the car. My father and my grandfather just both being devastated that Stein had passed. That's how much he meant to Welsh people, because he was one of them. He was a miner, And there's an amazing story Ferguson tells of before the game. because the strike was on, there were boys out collecting for the miners' union, and Ferguson said was deep in conversation with Stein, and he walked past it, and Stein stopped him and said, "I'm surprised at you, Alex," and he put a £5 in, and Ferguson went, "Oh yeah," because Ferguson was a union man as well, and put the money in as well. And I remember some of the boys who had the buckets, because I knew them, they were in school with me. Some of the lads who'd gone down with the buckets for the strike. So it was one of my most poignant childhood memories, really, that night, and what happened with Stein and Scotland and that thing. And I remember it, vividly. And I remember just the respect. A policeman later who was on duty that night said that there wasn't a single arrest after the game. And a game of high emotion in the mid-80s, he said, because of what had happened with Stein, it had completely sort of like taken, I don't know, it changed the atmosphere of the night, really.
That Ferguson story, I had that in my notes there. I had that. That's in his book. He mentions that in his book. Because, of course, Fergie was a union shop steward, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He was, yeah.
Killington, I think. But I'm actually going to quote you from Tony's interview with you last year, because it kind of sums it up. Everybody, you said at the time, when you get interviewed by Tony, everybody felt it that night at Ninian Park because he was one of us, a socialist, a miner, and you felt a close kinship to Jock Stein. And that kind of brings us on, Tony, to kind of talking about Jock Stein as a man rather than just as a manager nicely, I think. Now, Johnny, you I'd read an interview with you. I think it was The Big Issue. Yeah. I think you actually wrote it. I don't think it was an interview. I think you actually wrote it. And I did, yeah. Basically, you spoke about their working class mining backgrounds, as you did today, and the personality traits that brought about. But you said in it that although some people might say that clubs these days and the sport in general has changed beyond all recognition, that DNA is still there. What did you mean by that?
I think that Liverpool, Manchester United and Celtic are very specific personalities as clubs, and I think that can be traced back to the three men. I think the three men left their DNA. Liverpool fans have a really famous thing where they put it up, Scouts, not English, Manchester United fans don't support England. I've got Man United mates, I've got Man United mates, we don't support England. And that's something very specific to those two clubs. They're almost like apart from everybody else. And Celtic have got a very similar thing, I think, in Scotland. They're always kind of outriders, I think the word is, slightly outside the sort of establishment and the norm. And that's what miners were, that's what union men were. They were always... my father used to say a wonderful thing that the miners used to say, it doesn't mean you're better than anybody else being in a union, but you're as good as anybody else. And I think those three men had that. They didn't bow down to anybody, and they wanted respect, and they wanted respect for their football clubs. And the fans, I think, still feel that, that they have a certain character, the clubs, Manchester United, Liverpool and Celtic, that makes them slightly different to other football clubs. And I think that comes directly from them three men and the characters of them men.
Those three men built the modern day football clubs that we know now, Johnny, didn't they? I mean, you say that their DNA runs through it. If it wasn't for those three men, Manchester United, Liverpool and Celtic wouldn't be the powerhouses that they are today, wouldn't be world famous football clubs with a support in four corners of the globe. I mean, I truly believe that.
I sound old fashioned here, but I kind of think that it was done fairly as well. Shankly talks about it with Busby. He says, look, they became successful, and then they garnered big crowds, so they had a bit more money because they were successful, and they bought players. He says with his own money that he got for the turnstile. Liverpool the same. There was no big benefactor coming in. There was no oil state coming in. They built it, and we try to talk about this in the film, and Archie again mentions it. People forget how dominant Rangers were in Scotland up to that point. Celtic, we all know now that Celtic are a hugely successful club. But when he went there, they were really they were struggling. Same as Manchester United. That was a bomb site, basically, Old Trafford. They couldn't even play there. And Liverpool were a second division team. They all went to teams that were... Because the problem we've got now is they're so sort of established now in our psyche, Celtic, Liverpool, Manchester, as big football clubs, that we think it's always been thus. But it really wasn't until they went there, built these empires, again, Shankly going, 14 years in Europe. He said it wasn't by accident. I wanted us to become, he said, I felt like bloody Napoleon, I wanted to build this up. And Liverpool, people always say that Liverpool is like a cult. Their fans are like a cult, aren't they? People always got Liverpool fans, and they are. And it comes from Shankly, It's like, if you go to Anfield you can expect people to sort of. Robbo sent me a great line once. He says to me, "Oh God, they always played 1-1-8. Was their formation at Anfield. They sit on you. It's like you can't get out of your own box. Still similar now if you think of it. And then Manchester United, it's like they want to play great football at Manchester United. It's slightly different, I speak to Manchester United fans, they're like, you bob on with that, Manchester United, when they clapped off, the original Ronaldo when he scored the hat-trick against them, wouldn't happen at Anfield. At Old Trafford, it happens because Busby was just a bit more of a, could sort of sit back and enjoy football and whatever the team is, And then Celtic is, something very sort of specific to what Stein was like. Do you know what I mean? Stein was like, I absolutely want to make this football club into an empire. I want to make it into a European empire. They were always looking for other worlds to conquer, the three men, and I think that's still there.
And the irony is that they were all born within a specific radius, yet they conquered the football world, Johnny. These three guys who came from...
It's no accident. Amazing. It's no accident. I mean, Paddy Barclay says, you were basically, he says, the year of revolutions, I think, was 1848 in the Austrian coffee houses cemented this thing. He said Glasgow was the football equivalent in the early 20th century. Record football clubs were always broken in Glasgow. London never even came close. And he said, it was an intrinsic part of life. It was up there with religion. It was like the football was everything to Scottish people. In a way that's different to sort of the English, who had a different way of playing the game, that sort of kick and rush that comes from the medieval game. In Wales, it was rugby, got a real foothold amongst the working classes. Whereas in Scotland, in that industrial belt, it was extraordinary. And Matt Busby was brought up in a street 2 streets away from Alex James. Now, Alex James was like the Messi or Ronaldo of his day. Now he's 2 streets apart. So, they were absolutely immersed in football all around them. So, I always think these things are never by accident. There's always a reason why, as a kid growing up, Scottish football managers were considered the best in the world. They just were, weren't they? And that comes from like that time in Scottish history where football became everything to people and they played it better than everybody else. I mean, so many English teams, the spine of the team would be Scottish. I mean, you only got to look at Forest and Liverpool in the late 70s, extraordinary. The 2 best players, Dalglish and John Robertson, both Glaswegians. And I think that comes from that time those men grew up where they were absolutely obsessed with the game.
I remember a kids' programme about a football team, John's, a cartoon programme. It's called The Hurricanes, and their manager was a Scottish guy called Jock Stein. Jock Stein, and you're thinking, I mean, and that was years later, you know what I mean? You're thinking, who did you model that on? But you're seeing into the psyches, you say, they were known the world over.
In Forest, I know that they used to have 5-a-side games, and it was the Scots against the English. And a lot of the English players just go, that's unfair because you'd have like Kenny, John Robertson, and they go, we need 1 or 2 of them, on our side. And that was Forest when they were winning European Cups, and same in Liverpool, with Souness and Dalglish and Hansen. The spine of that team was Scottish,
Going back to like the industrial kind of working class background that they came from, mostly Stein I'm going to go with here, but it kind of goes with Shankly too. Billy McNeil, in his autobiography, specifically said that he felt, rightly or wrongly, if he says he felt that Jock's time in the pits, despite his support for unions and all of that, meant that he wasn't as effective at fighting the players or his own corner in terms of getting them higher wages within the club because of the structure in the club and different things.
Yeah.
He said he was told Shankly was much the same from colleagues footballers down south. Does that surprise you, or does it kind of make sense?
No, it makes sense. Busby was the same as well. They didn't understand money. The 3 of them didn't understand money. They all lived in like sort of semi-detached or modest houses. They weren't interested in the trappings. And Shankly especially would take it as a personal affront if a player asked for more money. He'd be like, you should play for nothing. It's football. You know what I mean? You're happy to play. So they all had that. They all had that thing where they felt that the players should be happy to play for the club, rightly or wrongly. I understand why players would have been a bit, thing, but they came from an era where they just couldn't get their head around the whole thing of like trying to make as much money out of the game as you can. They were like, you become a footballer because you love the game and you want to play. And I think, certainly that affected Jock in the early 70s and Scottish football because, you lost your Macquaries and Dalglishs to English clubs, which you didn't in the mid-60s. In the mid-60s, you could keep players at Celtic and Rangers, as was proved because they were both European powerhouses in that era. But then when the money really started going up in the early 70s, it was very difficult to keep players then, because you could go south and somebody like Dalglish could earn 4 or 5 times the wage he could earn in Glasgow, which is a lot of money. And agents, you call them now, but you'd have people in somebody's ear saying, look, you've only got 5-10 years maximum. You've got to make the best of it. You need to earn your money now to set you up for the rest of your life. They had all that. Whereas Stein, Shankly and Busby absolutely weren't interested in money. There's a great line by Billy McNeill where he says, whenever you talked about money to Stein, he was a minor. He was a minor about it. He was a bit like, what are you complaining about? Why would you want more? You could be in a hole in the ground like I was in my 20s. You're playing football, you're getting well paid in his eyes. What do you want more for? So you're absolutely right. They all had that show, and they all had that sort of feeling that you should just be happy to play for the club and get on with it.
I mean, that goes back to what Shankly was talking about, this famous quote, and you get the players to do what they can do. It's a form of socialism without the politics, of course. I mean, that runs through all those guys, and it ran through all their teams, didn't it?
Massively. I mean, Ian St. John, who was a very fine player and a really good Motherwell team, and he wanted St. John. And then there's that great line where St. John says, I would have died for those supporters that chanted my name, So what happened was, I always think these managers got the personification of them on the pitch, I always felt.
Yeah.
And I always felt like, St. John at first for Shankly was him on the pitch. He would have died to win a football match. I always felt McNeill was Stein on the pitch, centre half. He was imposing, and he would control a game, and he would see the game. And then, of course, you had Busby, and Busby loved his Georgie and Duncan, and they were more creative players, as Busby was. So the men themselves almost had their personality on the pitch, I felt, with their great players.
And that goes back to the mining thing, doesn't it? When Stein spoke about it, that you had to trust the guy in front of you, because you couldn't see anything. So the guy in front of you was, your eyes and whatever, So
the best friend you'll ever have, I think he said.
The best friend you'll ever have, and the guy in front of him, and so that's that team thing, isn't it? That you're all in it together. So
my father had a thing where he said, look, you had to trust one another underground. There was no time for sort of gossip and politics. He said, because it was life or death. You had somebody with you. And I think like miners had something very similar to sort of soldiers that have been involved in battle. There's a certain closeness they have when you've been in those worlds that lots of us wouldn't understand, really, because once you've been in a situation that, is dangerous with somebody and you trust them and you come through it, it must create an incredible bond, And Stein always sort of said about that in his being underground, how he had this sort of like camaraderie amongst and he tried to engineer it in his teams, as did Shankly and as did Busby. They all, interestingly enough, talk about the clubs being like families, which I always think is an interesting word, because we all know how close mining communities were and how important family is, and they all spoke like that. They all spoke about the club being like a family to them, and everybody supporting one another. And Stein does that great thing where the little clip of him talking, somebody's having a bad day on the pitch, help him out. Make sure you sort him out. And that's like, you just go, well, I'll have you, pal, because you're already saying, if I have a bad game, which is human, then somebody else will come in and help you out straight away. Well, that's a clever bit of psychology straight away there.
Graham Souness tells a great story about that. Arthur Albiston, one of his first games for Scotland, and he didn't settle into the game really well, and so Souness just ran, and every time Arthur Albiston got the ball, Souness just showed for him, and he gave him a short pass till he settled into the game. And and it was years later, I think it was Sir Alex Ferguson was talking to Souness, and he was saying, Jock spoke about the fact that you guided Arthur Albiston through the game. And Souness was like, I never ever thought he noticed. He went, he noticed, all right. He said that he was really touched by that Jock Stein noticed that, and Jock Stein was like, he said it was a wonderful thing that Souness did, but Jock Stein never ever told Souness that, but Sir Alex Ferguson told him years later, and he was really touched by it,
They have huge respect for Ali McCoy's told us a great story when he was first called up, and he says that he was sitting there and he wanted to make an impression, and Stein was there, and he said, a young boy, and there was Dalglish, all the senior pros, Dalglish, Hansen, Souness, and they went, you want a pint, Ali? And he was like, no, I don't want a pint. You know, I can't even. No, we'll get you a pint. No, I don't want one. Just get me like, you know, soft drink. All right. Anyway, Douglas comes back, plops the pint down in front of him. Anyway, as Stein walks in, and he's thinking, oh my God, Stein's drinking. But apparently, Stein was in on the joke, you know, and he said, it just settled me in. Like, I was like, oh no, Jock, I don't drink it. You want to be all right? So, you know, he could be one of the boys as well, you know, and it was great fun. John Roberts told me a wonderful story about how much respected that he was. He said that, and he tells it in a after dinner speaking. It's very funny, but he was talking to a girl in a hotel. He wasn't married then, John. He said, and I was doing really well. And he said, and she said, look, I'll see you later. Here's the room number. So he thought, brilliant. So he said, she said, I'm clocking off in 15 minutes. Give me 15 minutes. With John's brilliant, 15 minutes. So anyway, he rings the room, no answer. Rings it again, no answer. And he's thinking, she's either fallen asleep or she set me up. Anyway, he goes up and he knocks the room, bang, 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 bang. No answer. So he goes down as a little Irish night porter who he met years after, who reminded him the story. And he went, I'm trying to knock up the girl in room 356. And the Irish porter went, there's no girl in 356. He said, that's Mr. Stein's room. Jock Stein's room. But he said, luckily, Jock had taken some sleeping tablets because he couldn't sleep famously and managed to fall asleep. But John said, imagine if he'd have opened the door. I'm standing there. What would I have said? Oh, am I in the team tomorrow, boss? But he said, I went white. And he said, years later, I met the little Irish porter who said, do you remember that when I saved you from knocking Jock Stein out from his sleep? But yeah, and that's the respect they had for him. John said, I would have, I don't know what I'd have done if Jock. Another time he was, him and Kenny Burns are coming from Crystal Palace to Forest, and Burnsy had too much to drink after the game, and they couldn't get on the flight. He was too drunk. So he rings Scotland, and this is where Jock clever. And he says, oh, Kenny's not very well. He's on the toilet. He's got diarrhea because he couldn't say he was drunk. So Jock says, all right. Then he said, well, look, he said, come in, we'll fly up in the morning. And Jock said, no. He says, I tell you what. He says, we'll book an overnight for you from Euston. So get yourself across the station and we'll book you overnight. And he thought, bollocks. So he had to go all the way across London because Jock would have known. London was get the night sleep up to Scotland. So he said it was no getting past Jock. He said he was razor sharp.
There's going back to him as a man, there's what comes across in the documentary and just in general these stories is like an innate decency. I think you put it that way. Whether it's getting into the Celtic fans to give them into trouble for some songs, or whether it's the Ibrox disaster, tending to victims, staying behind, that kind of thing. I think that comes through in that documentary and also in these wee stories, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he was very he was pivotal after the Ibrox disaster and trying to, help as much as he possibly could. I think he understood what happened there. He'd grown up as a Rangers fan. He'd been on those terraces many times as a young boy. But yeah, a decent man, and always I felt trying to diffuse things. Always trying to he hated bigotry, as Archie McPherson said, because his wife was a Catholic. And he'd seen it and he felt it firsthand, and he felt it from friends and family by playing for Celtic. So he hated that. What did he call it? He had a great term, stupid thinking. Which is a great line there, just stupid thinking. It's like, what's the point in all that? And I think that innate sense of decency always shone through a Jock. Everything that he did as Celtic manager, and he's rightly fated now as the greatest, not just Celtic manager ever, but possibly the greatest Scottish domestic manager ever, I think. And Ferguson, we mentioned him so many times, always says that in his opinion, he's the greatest ever, over Busby even. And I think, as the years pass, Bill Shankly's granddaughter said this, they seem to get bigger. When you see the banners at Celtic Park with him on there and things, he gets bigger every year. And every time a manager comes in, whether it be Martin or now with Angie, if they get any kind of success or play any kind of football, people immediately say it's like Stein. It's like he's always the reference point. For Celtic fans, he's like they play like the Lions. It's like a Stein team, and so he's the blueprint really for the club, isn't he?
You talk about Stein as well and being charismatic and being a man of the people. There was that brilliant incident at Ninian Park that time. Remember Neville Southall was complaining that the balls weren't coming back.
Yeah.
Stein walks to the crowd and he goes like that, and about 40 balls. He's just like, don't act the goat, just get the balls back. Because Neville Southall was like, where's them? Because they were keeping the balls as souvenirs. I think they were the tango balls, weren't they, at the time? But And you actually see him, he walks across over to the fans and he goes like that, come on guys, the balls.
Give me the ball. Well, that great one we talked about with Jimmy, where Jimmy's substituted for once, and he kicks aside of the dugout and goes in. And Fergie tells the story, doesn't he? Jock's furious, goes in after him, and he locks himself in the toilet. He goes, "Get out here now, Jimmy. I'm not coming out. You'll hit me. You'll hit me." He had to promise, "I won't hit you, Jimmy, but come out. I need to talk to you." It's like that's respect. You know, I'm not coming out. You'll hit me.
And it doesn't matter how many times you hear them or people tell them. You know, you laugh. You might know what's coming, but you just have that kind of affection, don't you? It never leaves you, that affinity for, you know, someone like Stein and Busby and Shankly. You know, I mean, my old man always used to say about Bill Shankly that a lot of his sayings, he called them well-rehearsed ad-libs.
Yes.
You know, but I mean, there's just so many of them, and you can quote them verbatim, but it just makes them so special, doesn't it?
Well, he was brilliant on, and it still exists now. He says that the English press, the English journalists, he said they're not journalists. It's like great line. He said they're just sucker fans for the English game. So they don't talk about other. And it was really important to him that they beat Leeds, which they did, the great Leeds team. But there's the way he just sort of, and he's right. He's going like, you know, that the way the press report football in England. He said it's not objective. It's, you know, they're just what he says, the disciples of the game there. You know, it's not, and he's right, you know, and it's still the same now. This theory around the English national team and teams still exists. And he, you know, I've got great mates who are England football fans who say to me, it's our biggest problem is our media. And Stein was talking about it 40 years ago, saying that's their problem, you know, is that their press, the way they build them up, you know. And so he was so insightful, you know, in the sense of he knew how the game on and off the pitch, you know, operated. He was, one of his last interviews was really sad, but he was great actually, because he was on with Mike England, and he was on with Bobby Robson and the Northern Ireland manager who what was his name now? He played for Everton for years. Really, Billy
Bingham. That's
him, Billy Bingham. And the four of them were on screens like this, and it gets a little bit touchy with Mike England, because Mike England's going, they're saying, oh well, you know, apparently I think Rush had picked up a knock and was he going to play, blah blah blah. And Stein totally diffuses the situation, because it's the interviewer that's winding it up. And Stein just goes, do you know what, Mike, at the end of the day, it's not even down to us, it's down to the boys who'll be on the pitch. And Mike England goes, yeah, you're absolutely right, Jock. You know, he just takes a sting out of the situation by going, don't get annoyed by what he's asking. You know, there's almost nothing we can do once they cross the white line. And it's a real moment of like an elder statesman almost, with years of experience, saying, look, don't worry about it. You know, whatever happens, they'll try and wind it up. But what happens on the pitch? A bit like the great story of Ferguson when he got to the European Cup Winners' Cup final with Aberdeen, and he gives to Stefano the present, because that's what Stein did in '67. Well, make them think that you're just happy to be there. Oh, great bit of psychology.
And there was also that great clip, I think it was in Grand Prix TV, and he's sitting in the studio with Frank Feather and Stein just, I mean, he just said, great insight, great. And he just sort of called it how it was going to pan out. He said, this is not the Real Madrid of 1960.
Yeah.
Aberdeen are playing a myth. They're playing a legend.
Yeah.
Don't play the myth, don't play the legend. He said, and if they do that, he said, they'll beat Real Madrid. He said, I think there's a confidence in that dressing room that they can beat Real Madrid. And I'm thinking, my God, imagine saying that on TV and it all coming true and it panning out the way you said it. I just thought, my goodness. And also doing it, going over, because as you say, Sir Alex Ferguson invited him as a guest.
He did.
Do you want to say anything? And he said that's what he said. He didn't want to take the shine off Alex Ferguson. It was his team.
Yeah.
But all he said was before they went out was, don't play Real Madrid, the myth or the legend. Just play the football club and trust yourselves and trust this man here. And he left and then went in and repeated it on Grampian and Aberdeen won the Cup Winners' Cup against Real Madrid. I mean, it's amazing. You know, I mean, the whiskey trick was brilliant.
Oh, I mean, they all say the same thing about them. You know, they weren't much, even Shankly, you know, and it's, funnily enough, Clough was very similar. You think, these going to be these amazing Churchillian speeches, but actually they'd say something really simple, you know, something really simple, which the players understood, and just let the players go out and do what they needed to do, you know, and that was their genius, I think, you know. And Archie again says this wonderful thing where he goes, I've heard wonderful talkers of the game, you know, people who can but they can't make a football team stand up when they walk into a room. He said Stein could. As soon as he walked in, everybody got up, and he said you can't teach that, you can't learn that. That's just an innate in their character, and Jock Stein had that.
John Clark told, was it you, Tony, in the interview with you, says at half time, he literally just said, keep playing your own football, it will come, that kind of thing. There was no panicking.
No.
There was no, we won't get through this. It was complete belief that play the way that you can play and you will win it.
Yeah.
And it obviously came to fruition.
he did this amazing thing where he'd open the window of the dressing room, and he'd go, you're in footsteps, they're ship workers and miners, and that's who you're playing in front of this afternoon. Busby used to say something very similar. He used to make the team look at the Trafford factory park and say, all this lot coming in here today, that's who you're entertaining, that's who you're playing for. Don't leave anything out there on the pitch, and that's all they needed to say to them, and the players got it,
Shankly did the same when he was standing on the steps of when they were coming back from one of the cup wins, and he, in his usual gruff, I've drummed it into them time and time again. They're playing for you. And
it's you that pay our wages. It's you we play for. If you're a player, Paddy Barkley said a great thing. He says, there's nowhere to hide if you're a player with a manager like that, because he's got such a connection with the support. You can't hide. You can't. So they won't turn on him. They trust him, and he's going to them. Right. You're playing in front of me, not just me, but playing in front of them. You need to perform. There's nowhere to hide, and I think, in all fairness to Liverpool, they've certainly got that again with someone like Klopp. Manchester United have had a rough few years, and and you can see how important a manager is. I said I do a bit of work at Nottingham Forest. Steve Cooper coming in last season was the reason Forest suddenly caught fire. The manager is still, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important person in any football club. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Ange Postecoglou's shown that at Celtic the last year, Tony, hasn't he? I mean, total buy-in, I think, is the way that we would say, total belief.
Yeah, we all know it. It's still the most important appointment you can make in any football club is the manager. It's just a fact,
Where do you stand on Jock Stein's legacy, Johnny? Where is he in the pantheon of managerial greats?
I mean, certainly for me, should be spoke about as one of the greatest domestic football managers ever. Did a great job at international level as well. But my missus is off to all the best. She's off the funeral. I think what Celtic achieved in 1967 is one of the most remarkable things in the history of sport, let alone football, because they won everything you could possibly enter. And remember, a really strong domestic league. Rangers had got to a European Cup final that year. You had a really strong Aberdeen Motherwell team. So they did it brilliantly domestically, and then went to Europe and beat a crack Inter Milan team in the final. So I don't think there's many examples. Somebody said when I did the film, only one person said to me there was an Egyptian football team that did it apparently as well. But other than that, I couldn't find of another sporting team that won every single competition they entered that year. Won every single one of them. It was remarkable, and it's such a rare thing in all football, really. Manchester United won the treble, but they didn't win the League Cup that year. So there's always a thing. Whereas Celtic won every single competition they entered, which I think is just incredible. Because it's like anything; it's so difficult to do things because of the pressure, and you start feeling it. And when we did the film, you got some of the Lions talking. They were going, we just felt that we were winning everything. Where's it going to stop? But he said Stein was so good at sort of saying to them, just keep going. Play the next game. Play the next game, and then play the next game, play the next game. And that's what they did. And then they suddenly won trophy. And I think, that team in 1967, I mean, what? Like we mentioned earlier on, they had everything. They had a bit of steel about them. They could mix it, could score goals. They were pacey. They just had everything. You look at that team, and you go, I don't know how another football team in history, and I love to put football teams together, would have beaten them. A good matchup would have been Forest in 79 and Celtic in 67. That'd have been a hell of a game, wouldn't it? But it would have been a great game, because I just thought that Celtic team were like a machine, really. All the cogs just fitted perfectly, didn't they?
It'd have been a brilliant press conference too, Johnny. With the managers.
They were big mates as well, weren't they?
I can see who got the most words in. Funny. I know who my money's on, but Sean?
Tony, I've only got one last thing. It was a quote from Jock Stein himself that I'd jotted down, and it kind of fits what you were asking there about him in terms of the legacy. Where is he in the pantheon? He said once, "See, Celtic have been wonderful to me." You'll have heard this, Tony. you've heard of people being brought back from the dead. Well, it was Celtic that brought me back from the dead. Now, I'd say Jock Stein did that to Celtic when he went as manager. And I suggest when it comes to Jock Stein, there is no such finality as death when you leave the legacy that he left.
Yeah. I've mentioned earlier on, Sean, and he just seems to grow in stature every year, doesn't he? And what they achieved was such a remarkable thing. And you know, the game has changed in so many ways, but it's still the same. It's still so difficult to win a European Cup, as Manchester City have proven. They spent £500 million, didn't they? And they can't win it. He did with a bunch of local boys, you know, against crack European teams, you know, and nobody can ever take that away from him or Celtic. You know, that's just a fact. Celtic were the first British team to win the European Cup. That star will always be on the shirt. It was a remarkable achievement. You know, and comes back to the question they always ask me with the film. And ultimately, if you did put a gun to my head and said which of the three, I do think Stein is the greatest manager ever. Really, that's my honest opinion. I think domestically, the greatest football manager ever is Jock Stein. If you get Jock Stein in 1967, your football club's only doing one thing: it's winning trophies.
I think, on a positive note, to end the life and legacy of Jock Stein, we'll call time on it there. Johnny, you've been a wonderful guest on the Celtic Way Sitdown. Cannot thank you enough. Love that. Could have spoke to you all day. We usually do.
Yeah.
Together, but Sean, thanks for your contribution.
I'll be up soon as well, boys. I'm hoping to come up for one of the European Cup games. So we'll definitely have that beer up at
definitely. We'll certainly get together for that. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been a wonderful experience talking to Johnny, sharing his memories of the film, The Three Kings. And if you've never seen the film, The Three Kings, I suggest you go onto Amazon, Netflix.
Still on Amazon Prime, isn't it?
Go and watch it. You will not be disappointed. But for today, and thanks to Celtic Way Sitdown, appreciation for Jonny Owen, Sean. There we go. Johnny, you're
much
top
appreciated,
man.
Johnny. Yep.
And just remind everybody to, you know what I'm going to say, subscribe to Celtic Way. And if I get this right, because usually I get tongue-tied, you know what to do, hit that button, www.celticway.co.uk/subscribe. It's £1 for 2 months of full access. You'll get to see the pods, you'll get to read everything on the website. Once again, thank you, Johnny. Top man.
Welcome. Cheers, boys.
Cheers, Tony.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, lads.
Cheers, Tony.